Hi all, today I'd like to talk about the science and the scientists, the difference between the whole field itself and people doing it. Just a quick context, I started, a college, the equivalent of college in French. I'm a French Canadian from Montreal. I started, physics, biology, chemistry, and through philosophy ended up in anthropology because for me it was a more interesting and challenging scientific field. So of course I don't see the soft and hard science as like a fight between them. I respect them both, and I think they're highly complementary actually. But the epistemology of it are, although highly different, do point back to some fundamental confusions. And at these times, pandemic and everything, we do see a lot of not necessarily misinterpretation, let's call it different interpretations. And I'm going to give a quick example of my field, and I'm not saying I'm right, but I've been doing my my genealogical tree for a while. I have some some Irish, some First Nation, a lot of French. My son has more First Nations, and doing three and three. The H is the hardest thing for us French Canadian when we speak English. So doing the tree pointed to me the difference a lot, because I'm much more European than the mother of my child, and therefore my child as well. And I do see how the tree just stops. And you dig, and you just have something like savage on a pamphlet. To put it simply, Quebec has kind of three big linguistical group, the Iroquois, the Algonquin, and the Inuit. Most of Quebec's land is Algonquin, but when you look at the Iroquois, you maybe have a little bit more matriarchal war type society. Well, let's not get into that for now. What I really wanted to point out is that when I graduated from anthropology about 18 years ago, and I remember reading a study, I'm not sure when, but I do remember reading the study that said that more than 80% of the people of Quebec had about 2% of First Nation blood. And recently I've been seeing a lot mentions by so-called experts saying that only 2% of the population had First Nation blood. And I started thinking, wait a minute, what are they talking about? Because I remember reading it differently, and it's always an expert quoting an expert. And I'm like, has it been like, a chain of confusion that was transmitted through a certain respected teacher that did a simple human mistake? It doesn't mean that, somebody here is being dishonest. It's just a question of, how science works. Basically, if you believe me, if you trust me, if you hear me speaking and you're like, this guy seems intelligent enough, and then I throw you a fact, you might respect the fact as a fact because you respect me, right? That's the difference between science and scientists right there. I mean, there's a difference between the human talking, doing science, and science as a field where you have a lot of comparison. So right now I'm doing a critic of a lot of knowledge that I've seen, and I'm not even able to share an article about it because it's always someone quoting someone. It's always just someone saying it. But here why I think I'm right. If you do an average of, let's say humans usually have their baby at around 25, and I'm being generous in the sense that I could go at 19. But let's put it at 25. So we're giving each generation a 25-year gap. as an average. And let's put it at like 500 years since the Europeans have started coming to North America and America in general, whatever. Globalization, 500 years of globalizations. And therefore, we have something like 20 generations. Well, if you want to look at the 20th generation above you, you're talking about 1 million people. If you want to count everybody that's above you, you're around 2 million people. So like, for example, if I look at my parents, they are 2. My grandparents, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 502, 1024, and you go up like that 20 times, you're at 1 million people, and you have to add all the steps before, right? So saying that 80 plus percent of the French Canadian population, the Quebec population, let's confuse them for this exercise, has about 2% of First Nation ancestors. It's something like 40,000 ancestors. And of course, there's probably ancestors that cut, there's a couple of cousins there, a bit incestuous relationships here and there. That's normal in the history of humanity. If you look at it globally, you'll always find some kind of common ancestor. It's kind of the basis of the theory of Darwin. So anyway, look at it that way, and it's kind of huge. I mean, 2% sounds small, but you have to understand how there were different waves of immigration. Like, for example, in my tree, we can see Irish. I think I have a great grandfather that came with his son from Ireland directly. Well, whatever, maybe his daughter. But anyway, so I have a lot of Irish name in my branch at a certain time, but they aren't that far in the past. So if, like, for example, you hear your fathers say, yeah, we did the tree. We went up 20 generation back to France. And you can name people there and say, like my family name was Smith, and, like that Smith. And you see that Smith is, an English lord, whatever. But he only named about 20 people out of 2 million. Right? So it's a very small percentage, and that's where the illusion of the patrilinear understanding of life comes in play, because it's just a small percentage of the actual tree, So while I'm giving this example, I want to point out something more profound in the way science works. I'm not saying I'm right. I might be wrong. I might be the one misremembering the article that probably a lot of my anthropological colleagues read. But I kind of argue that mine makes more mathematical sense. Like if you go that far in the past, you have a lot of métissage. What is the word? Mixing. Like you have a lot of mixing of patterns. And of course, the British law did something like, there was les réserves, it's not like the Jew concentration camp, but it's kind of lands where the Indians were living, and they had like delimitation of territorial, and if they started living outside of it, they were no longer considered Indians. So all these are political and geographical laws that were in place, by the British to take power over the land. A lot of treason and a lot of bullshit, of course, but let's just stick to the fact here that a lot of people lost the notion that they were First Nation because of the way the oppressor behaved. And on top of that, if you look at just the French language We say sauvage, which savage, we call them savages, right? What savage really means is closer to nature. And there was this notion, really Christian notion of transcendental, like your reason makes you above an animal. They are below us because they are animal. But when we look more closely into modern times and we see how we are fucking up our relation to the environment, being a savage might actually be a compliment. It's really relative on how you consider the actual word and what it means. Being more harmonious with nature definitely is an advantage, in my opinion. I don't see their civilizations as weaker because they were less maybe technological and more in fusion with nature. Might actually be the opposite. Of course, while we're at it, I'm using my phone, we're communicating, we might as well use those technology. But it's not because a certain lineage of people came up with these discoveries that they are superior. They're bringing something to the table. Let's look at what the others are bringing. But let's go back one step. Let's literally go back one step and think about how confusing that can be epistemologically. The difference it can have in the mindset of, for example, a Quebecer in front of an immigrant. How he sees the world if he is told that he has no First Nation blood. If he sees himself as both European, Quebecois, and, First Nation and etc. If he can see that he has many origin, there's a possibility for him to open his mind into the diversity of life. And on a side note, I know there's a lot of Quebec bashing. I voted for sovereignty in 95, and I really see our desire to be sovereign from the Brits as the same one as the USA did. So if there's any patriotic American bashing Quebec, it just makes no sense. I can get it more from people that are from loyalists. They still believe in the crown, they still love Elizabeth. I don't hate Elizabeth. I'm just saying I believe in the sovereignty of nations. I think this unity and diversity will be more helpful for the whole of humanity rather than having like this huge empire that kinds of behaves, that kinds of wants a uniformity through the imposition of conformity, So for me, the UN can only be strong if every part is represented. And Canada kind of is a weird mix for me. But I can say the same of many regions of China, India, United States. I don't believe in Euros either. It's just my way of seeing life as sovereign nation uniting rather than empires imposing. And then you only have like 5 empires at the table, the Russian, the Chinese, the Indian, the European, the African, and the Americans, and that's it. It's not, there's much more diversity on Earth than that. And we need more 500,000 seats at the UN to have a world democracy. But anyway, I keep on opening parentheses, but I'm just trying to make a simple epistemological point. I'm just saying that all this knowledge has been transmitted for decades, that there's only 2% of the population that has First Nation blood, while it's much closer to 100% that has 2% of the origin that was of First Nations, because most of them were killed, disseminated, and everything. But the rest is not just pure British or pure French. There's so many different influences. It's a different thing talking about the ethno-linguistic notion of how Quebec and New Brunswick and some other parts of Canada and even New Orleans in the United States have a unique linguistic origin, But when you want to talk about DNA, you're much closer to maths, and a misunderstanding of these simple maths can create a huge misunderstanding in terms of cultural differentiations and appropriations and everything. So now let's make a quick clin d'œil, a quick, I don't know how to say this in English, but a quick turn back to the COVID, to the pandemic situation. And you can see how a lot of little things can be misinterpreted. Like the debate recently is, what's it called? A collective immunity. So the idea is that we don't know if people have immunity, but we don't know that they don't either, because we haven't seen anybody get really sick again. So we can assume that they have immunity, but it will take time to be sure of it. The same way we can maybe already have found a vaccine, but it's going to take a lot of time to test it. There's a lot of patience and a lot of precision that needs to be handled with science. It's extremely powerful. It can create a nuclear bomb that can destroy a whole city, and it can create a cure that can save the whole planet. Well, this disease is not going to kill the whole planet, but, if we just do nothing and assume collective immunity from the start, this could have been worse than World War II. It could, because we don't know how much people that are going to be saved would have died in a different context where they could not have received help. So I guess I just wanted to introduce myself on many different levels, but mostly where I started from was this confusion about the tree, about a small epistemological question, a small scientific data that was so misinterpreted through decades. And I'm not throwing anthropology under the bus. It's a bit harder to keep the mathematical mind in the soft science because there's so many qualitative aspects to consider. So maybe it's just like, a small mistake, and then by respect of your teacher, you repeat what your teacher said without actually have read the study. If I remember correctly, I did read the study, and most people that are, what's the word we say in English for that? Well, frogs. Like most people that have strong French, Canadian, Quebec roots that have been here for generations, most of them have at least one ancestor that is from the First Nation. There was a lot of mixing. Mixing is good. And, let's conclude with that. This idea of purity is a big problem in racism and everything. It's always like a kind of 4 or 5 colors, it's always like you're either black, white, red, yellow, or brown. You cannot be a mixture. You have to choose. You see people that have so little African genes that are saying that they are African. Mostly they're calling themselves black while they're as white as me, because they have traits that makes them look more Africans, and because they've been categorized. Because the moment you have this notion that you're not pure breed white, well, then you cannot be white, you have to be black. Well, actually most people are mixed. And it's there's this word in French, mulâtre, so there's black, white, and mulâtre. Mulâtre is like a word for métis, but it actually comes from mule, which is the mixture between the donkey and the horse, which is an infertile, inferior mix. So you have the white noble horse, the inferior donkey that can work the field, and then I don't know in English how it's called, but la mule, which is this inferior breed that cannot even reproduce itself. Well, I would argue the opposite. Most of humanity is going towards mixity, and mixity generally makes people stronger, because you can actually pick from different, genomes, and Of course, yes, it can create disease at first generation, things like that. It's a very complex subject. So I think I've opened way too many parentheses to go deeper into that one. And I just wanted to point out the complexity and the potential confusion of any scientific data. So before going to the barricades and giving your opinions on any scientific fact, take the time to read. I think everybody has a big opportunity right now to reflect, to ponder, to read, to think, and to discover this part of humanity that is science and that is very, fun and rewarding. You can really see it as fun. I've studied science most of my life. I've been an artist. I did some politics. I did a lot of things, but science is not boring. Science is extremely captivating and fascinating. And the more you read, the more you can do shit like I'm doing right now. Just start on rambling and going in all directions, because there's so many things that you can learn from the scientific field. So please just don't hesitate to jump in and learn more. And I'll see you next time, hopefully.